Thank you, Dr. Rathod. Thank you, Chairman Sir, for providing me this opportunity. Before I start formally, I'd like to make two things clear. One, that this whole idea of art and joy award, when I first heard, I told in the intro, in the first day of our inaugural session, that it was difficult for me to comprehend as a forester who is in Indian Forest Service, who has worked 30 years in Forest Service in India. What is this art and joy award and how does it fit into a very serious business of forestry management? So I started looking at it from February this year until this final day. I think I'm little clear, but point is I've tried to juxtapose my thinking on policy planning at a very conceptual and a higher level with this whole new idea of cultural based idea of art and joy award. So you might find certain places where at the end I would say that we would be looking into art and joy award, but I can't explain it how we'll go about it. Or probably we are sitting in the afternoon to do how we go about art and joy award, how we dovetail that. So that is one point. Largely I'll be focusing on the conceptual level of forestry management scenario in the country, in this country, India. Secondly, my previous speaker, first speaker had told that what is the condition in Britain. Opposite to that, in this country, most of the forests are literally under the control of government, and this is our colonial legacy. And also that many trees were very difficult to cut, harvest and transport, so there are a system of permit and permissions and regulations. Only recently we have got these permissions and regulatory regime getting little diluted. Otherwise we are still mostly talking of forest and forestry management from the government point of view, state forest management point of view, from the forest services and state forest services control them. I am from forest services, which controls at the highest level, and we have many levels. So thank you. With these words I'll start. Now, as I was saying, how do we dovetail this very idea of art and joy into the business of forest management use in India? Because on the face of it, the first one is related mostly to culture and the other one is a very socio-economic administrative kind of issues. But when I was looking at for the last 8 months, I found that possibly there is always a kind of a spark of a new dimension which comes to us. We start looking at things in a different manner, and then things get start working, something like what is called lateral thinking. So if I want to present my thinking on the forestry perspective, but also to try and dovetail this whole idea of art and joy award. So I'll say, well, what does this art and joy award means? I mean, if you have to see art and joy award, probably let's go and historically in the whole idea of forest management, management and the forestry issues, and how art and joy can be dovetailed into the whole thing. So I'll be making an attempt to do that. I would say art and joy is largely a cultural issue, and culture are based on a mindset, the psychology, the history, the deeper analysis of the whole creative thinking, creative ideas, metaphysical ideas, which in turns comes out into art, crafts and other joys. And personally, if you look only at art and culture, then possibly you're not looking into the other kind of mundane activities or mundane issues related to economics, availability of the resources. You are simply looking at the resource and you're working on it. So if that is the situation, the same situation held for wood. Now I am just saying what is the general perception in India about this aspect of how the wood or forestry resources from where the wood comes have been managed in India. So large part of my presentation initially would be what is the general perception about how the forests and woods were managed in this country. So before industrial revolution, we all know that there were less demand, technology was poor, and possibly both in the industrialized, so-called industrialized country today and the non-industrialized at one point of time, the conditions were same. So that one can see that if there were very big buildings, either in the shape of churches or other monuments made of wood, you have the similar in these so-called developing or in those days poor economies. You had one building, very old building, you can see in China, and another one is the sanctuary of truth in Thailand. Coming to India, many speakers in the last 3 days have made it a point that India is possibly a unimaginably diverse and unimaginably complex and varied kind of context and concerns, and it is part of our psychology to talk about trees and woods in every walks of life. You can see here that there is a temple of a tree. Now we as a nation comes across many trees where those trees are revered. Actually, many people have already spoken about it. We use them in many religious activities. We use them in Havana, we use them in yagyas, we use them in celebrating many important days. Then as we know that from cradle to grave, in every aspect of the day-to-day life, Indians are still using, particularly in rural sector, wood. We use it in Ayurveda, in one of the oldest wood-based, or rather tree-based medicinal form of practices, which is now being very widely getting accepted back in India itself. There was a time when these things got a little in terms of their acceptability, a low esteem. Now their esteems are coming back, and we're using a lot of Ayurveda, and a lot of Ayurveda spas you can see in ecotourism and our areas where we are looking at the side effects kind of medicines. Then all kinds of musical instruments, as in all over the world. We have all kinds of crafts, toys, things which we make out of it for ages. We use it very extensively in many other kinds of activities, leisure, play, in our day-to-day use. This is a cot where people are sitting. You can see these people are sitting on basically a wooden cot with a coir ropes. So I'll just go into what has happened over the years since, say, industrial revolution till this day, and what is the situation in terms of use of wood or forestry management in this country. And as I said, at the time of industrial revolution, most of us know that this is a general perception here in the written literature, that the colonies like India were being probably utilized or being probably viewed from the point of view of uses for both the colonial power as well as for the colonies. So what was used to happen is that it was initially, as we all know, is a requirement of wood for their industrial revolution, and later on for their all kinds of development purposes, wood was very essential. That's the reason why the colonial powers, most of them, lost their own woods. They didn't take care of it. They lost their woods, and they really look at their colonies. India was one of the major colony. And so what happened is that these countries which were industrializing, they required wood and they used them for large scale purposes for their own development. And similarly, the impact of that kind of management also followed in the colonies and countries like ours. We had two kinds of consequences of following the similar policies and practices. One is that important forests were reserved for the state purposes, and second was that traditional demands got neglected. Now, initially, these were very important forests of teak, rosewood, deodar in the north. These were getting reserved, and such forests where these were in plenty were reserved. And slowly, wherever there was a demand got increased, the other kinds of forests were also started getting reserved. And the reservation process in India started way back in 1870s, and it went on. And some of the places we are still doing reservation, but it started in 1870s when the first Indian forest policy was to be decided. That was around the time when Dietrich Binders, the first forester who was the Director General of Forest of India in 1860, who has started up this reservation policy. It went on, and most of the forests are now, as I said, under the government control. Now, what happened with that is that large number of people who are supposed to use these forests, particularly the forests which are on the fringes called community forests or village forests or the cooperative forests or various kinds of names were there, these forests also became part of reservation whenever they were having the valuable timber. So with the result, these people who were earlier able to use them could not use them. Now that is the time when I can say around the very fast development of the industrial movement, suppose 19th century and end of 19th century and early 20th century, then the art and joy that the 19th and 20th century took a different meaning in these two worlds, I believe. In the industrialized world, probably they have become prosperous in materially, and they had the they lost most of their forests, but then they started having a realization that losing a forest has consequences. And in this part, particularly our country, we started almost standardize our silviculture system, that is working the forest on the lines of European forests. As you all know, mostly are the monocrops, and here we had multiple varieties, as many as some of the areas in my state. I come from Kerala. There may be 300 species in a particular forest. So how do you manage in the same system? But practices got dovetailed, and they got merged in a fashion that we were started treating our own multiple species forests also like European monocrop forests. And so all kinds of silviculture systems were started being developed and tried, and they were used in such a fashion that other values other than the main value, that is the timber value, or that is the major economic value, was never been considered. Other than those values, for example, the non-wood forest products. So we had a lot of controversy till today. It was there. Recently we have changed the designation. We used to call all other products as minor forest products. Now we call them non-timber forest products. So there was large amount of controversies, large amount of disillusionment, and kind of heartburn started coming up with forestry sector, which was a dominant forestry services, forestry management was a dominant source of forest. They started picking up the cue from the European forestry, and without looking into the multiple uses and ecological and other environmental consequences of that. So large number of native species were neglected, and other consequences of this was when you started doing the plantations for important species like teak. We had one of the first teak plantation in 1842 called Connolly's plot in Kerala. 1842, the collector of the place, Connolly, Mr. Connolly, has started planting. First time the artificial plantation of teak was started in the world. At that time, teak was a major focus. And what happened is the neglect of other important species which were existing in those forests like mahogany or cinnamon or host of terminalias, host of diptocarps, host of other species. They were not looked into, though they were tried. Actually, the record shows the 19th century, there were many trials were made by forest department on other species. They were also coming up well according to my study on those, but they were never been followed. What was followed is only for those species which were required for the state. And at the same time, what has happened is the large number of people who are using forestry resources for different kinds of purposes, day-to-day purposes, day-to-day life sustenance purposes, they were not looked into. There were people who are in the traditional sector who were using them for their toy making, their musical instrument making, they were using them for their herbal products, there were many who were using them for their shelter. All kinds of those things got neglected from the perspective of the forestry management, the organized forest service. And these are the multiple consequences which occurred during that period. Now, in this period, one thing was still there, that forests were not commercially utilized to the extent that although the needs were there, colonial needs and the local needs were there, population was under control, forests in India was still in plenty, so that there were community forests, there were village forests, there were fringe forests from where people can get their needs and make their own products or can still manage. That was a stage, I can say, is the end of 19th century and beginning of 20th century. Now, in the Western world, I believe a strong technological base was continuously being developed because they were able to get the wealth and prosperity due to industrial transformation. And conservation consciousness gained serious momentum around 60s. Art and joy wood may have developed into niche kind of areas, niche kind of sphere my previous speakers have already spoken about. Whereas what happened in India after independence, we had a tremendous opportunity to look into what kind of policies and practices we must now practice in the independent India. That was in 1947, 1950s, when our forest policies were re-looked at. 1952, 1894 policy was re-looked at, and it was called as first independent India's first policy in 52. We had an opportunity to look into these issues, whether have we managed our multi-crops, multi-utility, multi-storied, complex, biodiversity rich forests in a proper manner. Have we looked into the needs of everyone, or are we to change our policies and practices? It appears that 1952 policy was nothing but a repetition of 1894 policy, and so same policy which was adopted in the colonial times was continued, and we did not change our policy. What happened to the practices? Actually, the practices also unfortunately continued to be very narrowly focused, and they were also not changed. So policy itself was not very integrated and holistic, and practices were also not up to the mark, with the result that we found that the forces of disillusionment, forces where large number of traditional sector people were feeling left out, they also started having their voices got heard due to these movements in the developed world. The consciousness of environment, consciousness of conservation was also picked up by certain elite, certain sections who were exposed to these developed world. They started talking about critically about the forest management in the country. Now, in the advanced countries, of course, there is a lot of technology development happened, and they started looking seriously about rebuilding their forests, and the conservation movement became the prominent discourse. But that movement also started in the 60s and 70s, brushing on the Indian elite, as I said, those who were exposed to these earlier movements of World Conservation Strategy, or this 1972 World Human Development Stockholm Conference. Those kind of things started coming in India in a particular section, in a very elitist kind of people, and they started knowing this about the, looking at the whole forest management and environmental movement, consequences of ill management of forests, and that become again in India also a major force. But at the same time, the forest departments were not very conscious, I believe. Personally, they were continuing to do their own practices and their own policies, and those practices and policy got another problem, that they were in a sort of a wave. There were never a consistency and holistic character in them. Certain waves used to come, a certain kind of policy thrust used to come in our practices. So we found that in the modern world or advanced world, there were lots of advances made, and environment consciousness came up. But here the waves started coming up in our country after independence. Instead of changing our policy, we started getting a certain kinds of wave in our practices. Whatever were going on were already narrow, but then the waves made it even more worse, in the sense we had started thinking that our forests were managed conservatively, so why don't we manage them in a more intensive manner? So increase of productivity by comparing with the developed world productivity, by comparing with the other countries' productivity, became the dominant discourse, and a lot of forests were cut. Traditional forests, that is multiple species forests, were cut, and plantations of commercial species like teak, eucalyptus, and other kinds of species, exotic initially, was started growing. And then there was also a wave which came up that we should relate our forest plantation with the industry, and then we had species like eucalyptus, and followed by many other species which were raised up by clearing of the natural forest, which were multiple species forests. Severally, along with this, consciousness was growing up about environmental, and people started talking about needs of people. People started talking about what about the poor people not getting firewood, small timber, and fodder. So the social forestry JFM kind of schemes were taken up, and now in this whole process, these thrust and waves were taking up from one thrust area to another thrust area, without looking into the consequences of each of these thrusts, and without looking into what is happening to the sectors which are totally dependent, the large number of traditional sectors which are dependent on them. So those sectors, as we said, were started getting neglected but still had resources as a common property resources, but those common property resources also slowly, because of reservations, because of focus, because of intensiveness of exploitation, also been removed and reserved. So those areas are also gone, and then so these traditional workers did not have the resources from the forest. They were looking it from the whatever trees existing in the private lands little bit, and also from the common property which were not under the control of the state government, and rural and tribal people were also put to a lot of alienation happened. Now in this scenario we find that in countries like our and in countries which are developed, there is a generally awareness about niche art and joy in the developed part of the world, and in this country art and joy seems to have almost lost the meaning. I mean, people don't see wood use as an art and joy. In fact, it has become a kind of a negative notion. So now, what is the peculiar situation today? India in the last few decades have started emerging as a fast developing economy. Some of our population which is in the age range of 20 to 30, they started getting a lot of money, they started getting a lot of income and surplus income, through which they can go and have their shelters. So large number of flats, large number of constructions came up, large number of residential demand came up, and people wants to immediately have the houses and furnish them. So they started looking for modular products, very fancy product, different types of product from wood, and that wood now naturally has started coming from import, because the sector, the forestry management was not geared up. We were never looking at the industry requirement at all till so far. At the same time, this new riches started looking at the modular. They were exposed to the developed countries. They were exposed to the modular designer, artifacts. So those artifacts and those kinds of modular, construction material as well as the furniture, they started getting through import, and so this process started occurring because import got liberalized, and forest managers who were already having these very thirst waves on very simple kinds of planting of selected species, those species which were whether attached with certain sector or not, whether useful for a sector or not, got into in a trap that they didn't know how to meet these demands. So what is happening is there's no proper policies to look into these aspects. Practices were poor. Earlier, the old people who were depending on the forest, they were marginalized, alienated, and we had certain policy changes in 1980s also, but those policies, though talk about rural poor and tribals, but it appears that somewhere in our policies there were integrated approach was missing. The tools to implement a policy were missing, so that things kept on happening the way without a control or without a proper management, without a proper holistic approach. So what happened is this large scale import started coming, and on the one hand forest dwellers, traditional woodworkers, which were feeling deprived since about 50-60 years, are now almost at the verge of losing their traditional crafts and arts. Most of them have probably stopped doing their traditional arts and crafts. They do not know who to approach. Department doesn't have any policy, any focus, any plan for that. So they were suffering, and now what is happening of late, that we came to know that even the plywood and panel and a paper based industry, which were earlier being in the thrust time, were given focus. When industry development thrust was made, basically paper, pulp and panel industry was given importance. Those industries have also started feeling the crunch of non-availability of resource. So this is happening at the other side. Beside this, we also find that because of not following a very kind of concentrated policy for looking into the demands in a holistic manner, we have not also developed the whole system of collecting data in a scientific manner. Now the forestry data, in particularly in our country, is a very data, is very wide data, and it's also a very gray data. Sort of, you can find different types of statistics for the most of the demand and supply figures, and sometimes we refer back, in fact largely we refer back to FAO data on our forestry statistics, and I often wonder why don't we have our own data. Why don't we say clearly that this is the data? But FAO generalize for data of all countries, and we also often recurs to that. So data is also a problem. Research and technology development has not gone the way it has gone in the developed world, that what kind of research and what kind of technology should be put in use, so that at least whatever we are looking for in the forestry sector, for example, we are looking for a kind of making available certain kinds of product for commercial and certain kind of product for the organized industry like paper and pulp, then what is the nature of research and development required even for that, leave alone which we have not looked into. So that was missing, and policy, as I said, doesn't have any kind of very strong integrated approach to see that policy does not remain as a dirt word. It is implemented, and if it has to be got implemented, what are the kinds of methodologies required to implement it? That is this kind of a situation. Parallelly, as I said, from 60s, 70s, 80s, and now almost at this stage, there is a whole assorted groups and of people and individuals who are very critical of forest management. We call them environmentalists, we call them romantists, we call them anti-foresters. There is a group which is called environmentalist group, normally labeled as NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They are very critical of the forest management. They have imbibed their values and their ideas from the developed world regarding the ecological and environmental consequences of misuse or deforestation or mismanagement of forests. So they have been always watching from this angle that forest departments have not been able to manage their forests in a manner which is required for this country, and the large section of people got alienated, and there are a large number of ecological and environmental consequences. So there is a stage which is very surprising today, that at one level there are people who started also saying that we have forest policies which are beautiful poems, but they are very intractable proses and they cannot be implemented. And that is a statement made by some of the very leading NGOs in the country. So we found Indian forestry today at a crossroad. It seriously required rethinking. It seriously required that it is a situation where almost every kinds of developmental issues was taken as non-starter, because foresters are supposed to be villain. Foresters are not allowing them to do developmental projects. So there is a whole lobby on development which thinks the foresters are villain, the forest managers are villain, and so we have to look into this whole thing, that whenever we are talking about development in this country, villains are considered to be forest people. And why is it? Now let's look at that also. That what has happened is that conservation concepts which has come from abroad in our country, those people, those whom I am calling NGOs or environmentalists, they had these notions, beautiful notions on ecological and environmental consequences, but without realizing the ground reality. So there is a force which they are truth in partial sense, but they are also talking, they are always talking about anti-forest management, anti-government policies, and they are always looking at all developmental projects as negative to the environment, negative to the forest, negative to ecology. Forest managers over the years have become most spectators in the light of their inherent weakness to meet the challenges both from environmentalists and genuine wood users. Forest managers therefore do not take any stand advocating about the genuine needs, whether the industrial need is genuine, whether the need of people are genuine. Foresters are generally mute spectators, keep quiet. They tend to take a silent view in most of the important policy meetings, even the top bosses. Now, parallelly, we have growth in the economy causing ever more demand of wood material, which is largely, as I said, has been getting through import, because import got liberalized in our country since 1990, and the department is still not able to change its policies and practices according to this situation, where they have to meet the demand of people along with the demand of development, and they have to look at the whole thing in a holistic manner. So all these factors have now led to, in this country, a huge debate on conservation versus development. Everything become as anti-development, and the villains were foresters. So all kinds of steel projects, all kinds of major developmental projects, they have to go through environmental clearances, and often they say they are not getting timely done, over time overruns, financial over, large scale aggravation in their financial targets are due to because foresters and the environmental people are not giving them clearances. So all these things are happening simultaneously. Coupled with all this, the forest department still doesn't have a holistic policy and practices, skill and technology to deal with all this crisis. So this is the kind of paradox I see we are facing in this country today. Now, all this, when we have an overarching social thinking, when I'm saying overarching social thinking, I'm saying this group which are called romanticists, the group which is environmentalists, who doesn't actually manage forests, who doesn't have any responsibility, they have been always saying the critical of forest management. They always been saying that okay, ecological environmental losses has occurred because of bad policies of forest managers, and they also talked in the name of poors and tribals. But these people have now started having such a overarching influence on the policy makers. The large number of forest ministers also tend to speak their language. One example I'll give you, we have a recently scheme which has been mentioned twice by our seniors, is that Greening India. It's supposed to be one of the mammoth projects in the country, in the tune of 42,000 crores, the amount which is never heard of in this government for forest, in this country for forestry management. Now that much of amount they were talking about, but they're not talking about using that part of that amount to industry or traditional wood using sector. I mean, now, so the situation is that the wood use is considered to be negative now. Wood use has become a sort of a taboo, and wood users lobby has no say, in the sense that they are considered to be negative forces. They're not to be looked into this whole in this developing momentum, in this time when the country requires large amount of wooden products of different nature, of course, for the new riches, and country requires lots of material for their existing industry. Large number of traditional sector is suffering, but nobody is there to speak for them, neither the forester nor the political masters. In that case, what is the solution? So I was trying to add up this whole concept of art and joy, the end for the solution, but I would say, if you really look at the whole thing, it appears to me that there is a need now really to think about policy should not be only intractable prose. Policy should be a really beautiful poem which can be implemented. So we must need to have methodologies. We must have the instrument which can make the policy doable. Problem is, policy speaks very, very large number of things. Huge amount of ideas are put in policy, but it has never been defined how the various actors, both the users and the managers, as well as the people who can play a role of mediating, such sort of people like romantics, the NGOs, the other people who have this ecological and environmental consciousness, more theoretical knowledge, more wherewithal, more communication skill, how these people can be bring into the picture that we should not have the same story of foresters doing whatever they want and become mute spectators and almost helpless players, and the demand is sought by the poor people who have no voice, were not heard, they're marginalized, they're totally alienated. And there are people who can speak, who can communicate, who can make sound. They are environmentalists, they are NGOs, they are romanticists. They should come forward now to see that these two join together, and that is the kind of methodology the policy must look into at one level. Then the planning, as I said, trust should not come. Now we must make our plans on the ground based on whatever is needed. If it is wood sector which is missing, a wood sector which is suffering, whether traditional or the organized, they must be heard. But with this huge scheme like Greening India, we don't hear about wood sector at all. Wood sector is a taboo. Now they don't talk about the wood sectors. So what is needed is that we should actually look into the totality, the actual requirement of wood, traditional wood user sectors, traditional industry, the organized industry which requires wood, and all kinds of wood demands which is coming from neo riches in the future. At the same time, we should make our plans based on these requirements and develop appropriate strategies. Now, I think this can be done. This is very much possible. We need not look into conservation versus development kind of scenario. We can look into conservation along with development, or development along with conservation. And this is possible when we have the synergies taken from all sciences. Presently, the forestry science is supposed to have large elements of components from physical science, the chemical science, the other sciences. But honestly, when we see at the whole level and the depth at that kind of forestry science, we found we are far away from what is desired. I mean, a lot of development has occurred in the developed world, at least, even for harvesting techniques, transport techniques, using techniques, the processing techniques. But all those techniques, we are way behind. We need to have, now the time is that we create a synergy between all these sciences. We need a creation of synergy between advanced countries' technologies and this country's technology, and we need to balance our approach towards how much for conservation, how much for production, and on top of it, what is the kind of technologies which are required to do this balancing. Plus, I think we have a wonderful opportunity in the name of climate change, where large and almost everyone all over the world has started believing that this is not the time now to go ahead with the way we were going ahead. We need to look into greener technologies, greener materials, sustainable development kind of processes. So this is a time we should look up, as I said, policies which ensures proper implementation. That is, you should have all the three major actors to work together. Presently, we are all working separately, romanticists separately, those who have demands, vocal demands, political power, they speak against department. Those who have no demand, they are suffering, and forest managers are not bothered. They are just ineffective players. So we must bring up these three together. If you were to implement your policies, practices must be made realistic. Practices must look into everybody's demand. So they must look into the development requirements of natural forests, the conservation requirements of natural forests, and development requirements through plantation and production sector. And we should have a right data, appropriate technology, and we must do the concerted effort to change the mindset. Policy and planning, conservation strategies for natural forests, production strategies, plantation. We can look into substitution of carbon intensive materials like steel. We all have seen this many slides. I keep on saying in my talks about that there are figures around which says that if you take a 1 ton of wood, which is again photosynthetically produced, so doesn't need a cost for production, any amount of energy for production, but still if you take the inherent embedded energy in a 1 ton of wood, is 640 kilowatt, and if you take into 1 ton of brick, it is 4 times. If you take in 1 ton of concrete, it's 5 times. 1 ton of steel, 24 times. 1 ton of glass, it is about 50 times, and 1 ton of aluminium has 126 times more embedded energy requirement than 1 ton of wood. So it is still the cheapest material to produce, and it's got produced naturally. So you should now think of substitution of not wood by other material, but other material by wood. We can have for that appropriate researches, appropriate extension, appropriate technology development, wide substitution as I talked to you. Now we know that wood, there are a large number of plus points for wood. Extremely diverse, carbon neutral, renewable resource, needs low energy production, and perhaps the best choice in the present day changing world. Now, having made the scenario and the context clear, how art and joy will dovetail. Now, I said this art and joy appears to me, somebody was talking 2 days back, fourth dimension. Somebody was talking of, cultural aspect which comes out from our own heart as an urge to use the material. Now, that is something which I think is one which we can look at this scenario, these kinds of solutions which I was talking about, these kinds of solutions required if art and joy becomes our philosophy. Now, if our philosophy is that let's look at the whole use of wood from the point of view of beautiful material, scientifically the least carbon intensive, renewable, can be locked up, can be degradable, and also has a potential to make it can be neutrally produced for sustainable manner. In that case, art and joy, if this idea can be taken up, then what we can do is what we can then start doing is that we should start having a mindset to say that let's do all our activities wherein you can give this feeling which my two earlier speakers have told, which is totally missing in our part of the world, because as I said, wood use is now considered to be a negative activity. Wood use is considered to be taboo. Wood use is considered to be loss of trees, related to loss of trees, loss of forest, lots of ecological and environmental losses, but it is never considered to be in these lines, which we know wood is perhaps the most used material still in the world, and perhaps the only answer in the climate change condition, only answer in this scenario where we are losing touch with the nature, where we have to be one with the nature. We have to use a material which we can feel good about, where we can feel the urge of the heart to come to use a particular material for our construction. And given that, art and joy is the right way, right approach, I believe, the right philosophy to even draw upon your policies and practices. So we can always say that wood use is definitely the answer in the climate change. Policies need to be designed, therefore, in these lines, that where you can say that even if initially you have a larger maybe cost of creation and larger kind of opportunity cost, something like if you can do a concrete and a steel building larger scale and required to be done in a faster manner, for which there is no technology available in this country, because we are not talking of 4-story, 6-story. These things have never been talked about. Only the old houses are there where 1 or 2-story wooden structures. Nobody in India is talking about 2 to 3-story, leave alone 4 to 6 to 9, which we heard, because we haven't had those technology. The whole word of use of wood is now gone out of use. The use of wood, the use of wood itself has gone out of use. I mean, nobody is looking at wood use and wood houses. So we have to bring in this use of wood, and we have to start looking at designing in such a fashion our policies that we encourage residential areas to be designed out of wood. We encourage many other constructions to be made out of wood. We encourage the traditional sectors which is using wood as an art and joy. We should encourage those people who are substituting the carbon intensive material, something like bamboo, for example, which is a great source available, second highest in the world in India. So these are the kind of things we should be looking now. And as I said, research, development, technologies, etc., which are needed to do that, which would encourage the wood, which can make the wood use mainstream, which can remove this whole negativeness of using of wood, where the forester should not feel shy of talking about wood users, where the whole romanticists are part of making wood use as a kind of a requirement of the day, and where the users come forward to tell us what are their demands, and there should be a kind of a synergy which should come into use of this wood. And so this synergy must then lead to art and joy, because we need to develop appropriate technologies. We need to develop in that, if art and joy has to come back, we need to develop new wood-based materials. We have to enhance the efficiency of the energy. And some of the works in this line, what we have done in Institute of Wood Science Technology, we have looked into enhancing the life of wood. We have done modification of wood by chemically modifying the wood. One can see that there are modified wood here, which is chemically modified. Unmodified has lost its color and it's getting degraded like this, but modified wood remains the same. This kind of work is done by some of our scientists here. Now we are also working on growth stresses. Now I'm talking of production forestry, what appropriate technology we are using, trying to use. We are trying to communicate to the world that okay, use wood. It is not as in India is not as technologically kind of large scale technologically standardized, but it can be standardized. We must start knowing its value. So there are stresses when you cut a eucalyptus tree. Certainly the stresses lead it to warp and split. So we have started having this instrument was designed by our institute, which can see what is the level of stress in a tree, so that we need not cut a tree at a very high stress level, or after cutting we have developed a kind of a treatment which will reduce the stresses, and then only it can be sawn. We have developed, I think most of you, if those who have visited our institute must have seen the wood polymer composite. We are substituting plastic, basically polythene, and we have 50% of wood waste and 50% of plastic, and we have come out with wood polymer. And this machine is actually developed by one of our scientists at our institute. Otherwise, cost in terms of several hundred lakhs. It was made in 10 lakhs rupees by our scientists, and we've got a product which is as good as any. And now we are looking for propagating this product, which is basically less carbon intensive. It is more strength, has got more strength, more of properties of wood. Now we're looking for biodiesel. We have also been working on how to actually take out biodiesel from the wood. Many people have been working in our country. Abroad they are working with the grains. In our country they are working with the tree oil seeds. But we are trying to work with wood waste. So we have already started the process. We have gone into the first stage of producer gas. From producer gas to using the Fischer-Tropsch technology, we're trying to bring biodiesel. Now we are also trying to inculcate this whole idea of wood use as a good. So we are trying to do all kinds of seminar workshops, and we are trying to communicate this to many policy makers to bring up all what is needed to make wood as a mainstream commodity. Wood should not be considered as taboo anymore. Wood must be considered holistically as part of the developmental requirement. It is not to be just left in the forest, but it must be utilized, but utilized in a manner wherein it can be used sustainably and it can be produced sustainably. Now, as I said, for all this to happen and our old art and joy of the past has to come up, we must start using wood, we must start propagating wood, and we have a motto also, like many people have said, wood is good. So we say grow wood, use wood, save the environment, to green the landscape, and to take the nation forward, and to let the art and joy come back to the hearts of people. Thank you so much.